Welcome back to Mythic Slumber. Tonight we keep our feet in Britain, fog over moor, oak smoke in the lanes, and the hard century after Rome withdrew its legions. Out of this sub-Roman dusk rises a war leader remembered as Arthur. Not a glittering fairy tale king, but a rallying name on battered shields. Monks copy chronicles by firelight, bards carry battles in verse, and later medieval writers shape courtly ideals around an older core. Excalibur appears as Caledfwlch in Welsh tradition. Camelot is argued over by place names and spades in the soil. We follow the British story only, from Badon to Camlann, and the legend Britain kept. Begin with the roads. They still run straight over the hills, as if certainty were a craft the land once practised every day. Stone on stone, cambered crowns, mile markers toppled but legible if you brush the moss aside, proof that Rome was here, and then, suddenly, was not. In the early 5th century, imperial couriers stopped coming, requisitions stopped arriving, and the island's neat paperwork thinned like winter light. Garrison towns along the frontiers, the old limes learned a new sound. Not the bootfall of a cohort, but the quieter arithmetic of villages deciding what to do next. Villas emptied. Some became quarries for their own walls. Some grew nettles in rooms where Hippocos once warmed the feet of owners who could quote Virgil while the rain explained itself on the tiles. Market days kept their habit for a while. Weights balanced, measures checked. A string of Latin phrases traded with prices, and then even those softened back into older tongues. Church bells, new to the island and still a little awkward on their ropes, learned to be sturdier than governors' seals. Bishops wrote the continent for help and received letters instead of legions. One chronicler would later call it the groans of the Britons. The reply, if there was one, did not bring shields. Power did not vanish, it reassembled. Westward and northward, in hill country that had learned to outlast every season, old polities reawakened under new names. Dumnonia in the southwest, the kingdoms of Powys and Gwynedd in the mountains, Reged beyond the passes, and the mixed Romano-British strongholds strung along the Severn and the Dee. Eastward, across the lowlands, new settlements took root. Saxon, Angle, and Jute. First as mercenary bands hired to fend off other raiders, then as farmers who liked the soil and did not love leaving. Between them lay borders that had to be patrolled, fords that had to be guarded, and roads that had to be kept open if a winter was not going to become a famine. Archaeology preserves the mood without writing the play. At South Cadbury in Somerset, a hill fort refortified on a grand scale in the late 5th and early 6th centuries shows ramparts thickened and gates rebuilt, the old Iron Age crown made royal again by pragmatism. At Tintagel, waves gnaw the cliff, while sherds of Mediterranean amphorae, wine, oil, tell of trade that did not quite die even when emperors did. At Wroxeter, the shell of a Roman city learned to be a timber town. Boards slotted into stone the way a people slot themselves into a past that no longer fits but still shelters. These are not fairy tale places, they are practical ones. You can stand in them today and feel a kind of stubborn competence rising from the soil. The island's story in these years is written by hands we mostly cannot name. A farmer trades a scythe for a spear when the alarm sounds, and then trades it back because hay will not cut itself. A headman learns to count not only sheep and measures of barley, but also the number of young men he can rely on when smoke climbs from the wrong valley. A monk sets down a sermon in rough Latin and rougher ink and adds a line in Brittonic, so the backbenchers hear what salvation sounds like in their own mouths. A woman with land and allies hosts a feast that is more than a meal. Alliances are salted there, quarrels soaked and softened, foster children pledged, oaths rehearsed, hospitality as law, in a time when written laws have nowhere to sit. Into this Britain, neither Roman nor wholly something else yet, comes the need for a leader who can be more than one thing at once. Not an emperor, not a petty king content with a single valley's tax. A dux bellorum, a war leader, capable of calling men from several polities to one purpose and making them trust the summons. Later centuries will give this leader golden halls and lists of faultless knights. The 6th century would have given him cold mornings, horses that needed shoeing, and roads that could be dangerous and necessary in the same mile. He would have to speak Latin to priests and Brittonic to hill captains, and he would have to know when either language was a waste of breath and a gesture toward the bread table would be better policy. The church is present, but small. Wooden churches lean against stone circles that remember older rites. Bishops convene synods that are also supply meetings. A cross carved on a pillar signals the faith's endurance. The boar carved beneath it signals the clans. Saints' lives begin to be told. Iltyd, David, Gildas. The lustre sharp pen who will later scold the age without naming its defenders. A silence historians still argue about. The faith that survives here is a travelling faith. Monks with scriptoria in their heads, reading psalms to the rhythm of footsteps and rain. Across the water, on the coasts and estuaries, longships test the island for weak places. Some come to raid, some to hire on, some to settle. To fight them is labour, to hire them is risk, to ignore them is not an option. So the West tightens its belt and its shield lines. The old Roman roads, Fosse Way, Ermine Street, Watling Street, have not disappeared. They are lifelines if someone can keep their ditches cleared and their bridges patched. A leader who controls the crossroads controls the year's breathing. The early sources are late to the scene and quarrelsome. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, laments moral collapse and praises a victory at a mount he does not name. A 9th century compiler we call Nennius sets down 12 battles under a single champion's banner and calls him Arthur, dux bellorum, the leader of battles. A 10th century annal will place Badon and Camlann on a thin timeline like pegs on which a century's cloak barely hangs. Welsh poems, some early, some later wearing earlier masks, let Arthur's name walk among heroes and hunters, a yardstick for courage rather than a court calendar. None of this adds up cleanly. All of it adds up convincingly to a need that had a name. What would such leadership look like from arm's length? Not the parade ground. The mustering yard by a ford. Men in wool and leather. A few in half-remembered Roman kit handed down and repaired. Horses steaming, a smith swearing at a snapped rivet, a priest murmuring a blessing the way you lay a hand on a door to feel whether the latch will hold. Orders go out in the shortest useful words. Messages ride on boys who can see over hedges and men who know which hedges are worth riding through. Scouts mark where the fen will swallow feet and where an old causeway still stands. Shield shapes notched, round, lock in a way that changes a skirmish into a wall. If the day goes badly, someone gets most of them home. If the day goes well, someone calls them back from the pursuit early enough that tomorrow still has defenders. At night, in halls that smell of oak smoke and spilled ale, law sits at table with meat. This is not the chivalry of a later age. This is survival with manners. A guest right enforced by glances more than guards. A feud quieted not by sermon but by gift. Rings, cattle, the promise of a roof when the winter goes long. Women keep the accounts that keep the alliances. Their dowries are bridges between quarrelsome streams. Harpers hold the room when talk starts to turn sharp. A good lay can save a bad treaty. Young men watch who is called to the high bench and measure futures in the span of a bench plank. Somewhere in this map, a name like Arthur begins to collect facts, victories told by multiple mouths, a knack for being where trouble can be made smaller, the ability to keep men from wasting themselves after noon when dawn has gone well. He is not a myth yet. He is a rumour that pays for itself. A hill fort with new timbers, a road with patrols, a church with a roof that doesn't leak, a set of place names that strangers pronounce carefully because locals do. The island will turn him into a legend later. Right now, it needs him to be a schedule that holds. If you listen long enough in the quiet between storms, you can hear the island assemble its hope. Hooves on a ridge, a conch blown in a valley that used to call Romans and now calls cousins, a hammer at Cadbury, a shout at a ford that sounds like relief. The roads, those old straight roads, will carry these sounds farther than any one tribe's horizon. Out of their intersections a leader. Out of his presence, a pause in the long push of newcomers. Out of that pause, a generation able to repair fences, teach children their letters, and remember that bread is nicer than hunger and law is safer than luck. This is the Britain we keep for our story. Not the Europe of crusades, not the France of courtly catalogues, not the far-off islands of other seas. Fog on moor, iron in river water, Latin names bruised into Brittonic speech and both doing their jobs, an island that has been left to itself and is discovering under pressure what kind of self it wants to be. From that pressure a figure steps forward whose edges we cannot draw sharply, but whose weight we can feel, enough to set a table, muster a host and hold a year together. Later bards will hang gold on him, and later still monks will hang morals. For now, in the early light after Rome, he is a man on a horse on a hill above a road that still runs straight, listening for news, deciding where to be useful next. If you go looking for Arthur in the 6th century, you will not find a banner flapping in plain view. You will find margins, pauses, and names that behave like footprints in rain, suggestive, partial, worth following even when the trail fails in bracken. The age did not write biographies. It wrote warnings, sermons, genealogies, battle lists, and poems that prefer thunder to maps. Out of those a figure begins to form, not certain, never certain, but insistently there, like a hill you keep glimpsing between trees. Begin with Gildas, a monk whose words were meant to sting his contemporaries into repentance. Writing sometime in the second half of the 6th century, he composed De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, a sermon braided to a sketch of recent history. He condemns tyrants, names some, spares others, and tells of a great victory won by the Britons at a mountain he calls Mons Badonicus. He does not name the commander. This silence troubles and tempts historians. Perhaps he thought the man's fame needed no repetition. Perhaps he avoided celebrating a warrior while chastising kings. Perhaps he just didn't care to give the age a hero when his purpose was reproof. In any case, Badon sits on the page like a stake in the ground, a battle that checked the Anglo-Saxon advance and won Britain breathing space. A few centuries later, a compiler we call Nennius, or the author of the Historia Brittonum, circa 829 830ths, poured older materials into a new vessel. Here the name Arthur steps out with job description attached. Dux Bellorum, leader of battles, not king, not emperor, commander. The text lists 12 battles under Arthur. The names are a geography lesson that refuses to settle. The river Glein, the river Dubglas in the region of Linuis, the river Bassas, the wood of Celadon, Castellum Guinion, Urbs Legionis, the banks of the river Tribruit, Montem Agnet, and last, Badon, where Arthur is said to have carried Christ's image on his shoulders and cut down 960 men in one charge. Numbers like that signal epic, not muster rolls. Still, the roster suggests campaigns across multiple frontiers, forest, river, hill, exactly the sort of pan-regional coordination a dux could provide in a fragmented island. The Historia is a late witness to earlier events. It is also a collage. Its authority is uneven, its motives mixed. Edification, pride, perhaps politics. But it preserves local memories in a way tidy chronicles might sweep away. When it calls Arthur not king but commander, it leaves room for him to operate alongside multiple rulers, binding them briefly to common purposes. And when it names Camlann elsewhere in another tradition, it leaves us an ending to match Badon's pause. Turn to the Annales Cambriae, a set of terse Welsh annals compiled in the 10th century from older material. Here, 2 entries added like pins to a flimsy timeline flash with significance. Under the year corresponding by one reckoning to 516, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victors. Under 537, the strife of Camlann, in which Arthur and Madrout fell, and there was great mortality in Britain and Ireland. The annals do not narrate, they mark. Their brevity is both a frustration and a gift. No embroidery, little bias we can read, only the insistence that at Badon a certain man mattered, and at Camlann he fell with another, whose name, Madrout, later Mordred, carries the hint of fracture from within. Poetry keeps different records. Early Welsh verse, complicated by layers of transmission, sets Arthur among hero names as a measure more than a man. Y Gododin, a praise poem for northern Brittonic warriors who died at Catraeth, likely Catterick, contains a line in one manuscript tradition. He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. The point is not biography, but yardstick. Courage is something the name can quantify. In the enigmatic Prix du Anwerfen, the spoils of Anwerfen, Arthur is captain of a raid into the other world. Mythic, not historical, but natively Welsh and stubbornly insular. In Caelfwlch and Olwyn, one of the earliest prose tales in Welsh, Arthur presides not at a French court but at a lively British one. His companions bear Brittonic names: Sei, Kai, Bedwyr, Bedivere, Gwalchmai, Gawain's Welsh root, and the business is feats and riddles, boars and giants, not imported chivalry. These strands do not prove a 6th century commander, they prove a Welsh Arthur before the French Arthur took centre stage. Genealogies murmur too. Welsh pedigrees copied by monks with equal parts pride and confusion, thread names like Art Acher through family lines. Some are later insertions, some genuine. The repetition matters. It suggests that Arthur began as a personal name that households wanted, not merely a symbol later poets inherited. Etymologists argue quietly in the corner. Does the name descend from a Latin Artorius, familiar in the army, or from a Brittonic root artos, bear, with a noble suffix? Bear man, bear king. Either path keeps us on the island, in the mixing bowl where Latin and Brittonic rubbed shoulders long after the legions left. Between these textual islands stretch long reaches of archaeological sea. Spades do not unearth Arthur, they unearth context. Hillforts reoccupied and greatly strengthened in the late 5th, 6th centuries, South Cadbury, Dinas Powys, speak to elites investing in defensible courts. High-status pottery, amphorae and fine tablewares turn up along the western seaways, proof that someone's ship still traded for Mediterranean wine and oil. Inscribed stones in Latin and Ogham note burials and boundary claims. The names on them a blend of Roman and native. None of this says Arthur lived here. All of it says an elite with Roman habits and Brittonic loyalties ruled here. The exact ecology in which a coordinating war leader could thrive. The trouble, and the lure, is the gap between event and writing. The earliest notices that say Arthur by name arrive 3 to 4 centuries after his supposed lifetime. They draw on earlier material we can't see whole. Scribes copy, gloss, and sometimes improve. Monks writing for patrons mix piety with politics. Local pride colours lists. Miracles accrete around bones and names. The Historia Brittonum may have been assembled to offer Britons a past as sturdy as the Saxon genealogies being sung over the border. The Annales Cambria may compress varied local memories into a single island year. Even so, the silhouette that results is internally coherent. A generation checked the eastward push. A commander's name concentrated loyalty. Civil fracture followed. One temptation is to import certainty from later literature. The polished Arthur of Geoffrey of Monmouth, 12th century, with his pageants and conquering tours, or the courtly Arthur of Chrétien and Malory with their codes and quests, resist it here. In this segment we are still in Britain's earlier dusk, where the sources stay local and the aura keeps to western hills and northern kingdoms. The fact that later writers could graft French romance onto an older trunk tells us the trunk was strong enough to carry such weight. It does not tell us the trunk began as a gilded pole. Another temptation is to deny the figure entirely because the paperwork is thin. Yet the island's silence is informative. When you have an oral culture riding tandem with scribes, when monasteries burn and libraries travel in heads, when authority depends less on titles than on success, a name that persists across hostile centuries has done a kind of work other names do not. Arthur becomes a way to say, there was once a commander who made the island breathe easier. Whether he lived precisely as later storytellers say is less important at this stage than the simple claim that he lived enough to be useful to memory. Notice also the titles. Dux Bellorum, leader of battles, fits a federating role in a Britain of many little kings. Such a leader can rise by merit and alliance, not inheritance alone, and can fail when those alliances fray. That shape aligns with the 2 pegs we have, a victory that steadied the island, Badon, and a ruin that felt like a family argument, Camlann with Madrout named beside him. If you built a life out of such pegs, you would have a commander who won time and then lost it to faction, the sort of life that communities turn into legend because it mirrors their own cycles of union and fracture. Why then, does Gildas omit the name? Perhaps because he preached against pride and preferred not to mint a hero. Perhaps because the leader belonged to a rival patronage line. Perhaps because his audience knew the story well enough that providing a name would have invited the wrong kind of listening. In any case, later Welsh sources fill the blank with confidence, and their confidence stays local enough to trust. Arthur is not mailed in from far courts. He's spoken of in the same breath as British rivers, woods and fords. So we stand with a handful of witnesses, a sermon that marks a battle without naming a captain, a 9th century compilation that names Arthur and gives him 12 fights, a 10th century annal that pins Badon and Camlann to remembered years, early Welsh poems that use his name as a yardstick and seat him at a British table, archaeology that frames an elite capable of such leadership, and onomastic habits that plant Arthur in family trees. Each item alone is thin. Together they make a serviceable bridge from history's muddy bank to the firmer ground of plausible life. Cross it cautiously. Keep Britain under your feet. Here Latin and Brittonic share the same hall. Picture hill forts shining with new timber. Roads patrolled by mixed retinues, priests praying in rough Latin while warbands eat bread salted with counsel. In that noise a name gathers weight. Sources, not certainties, but enough to start a story without cheating. Picture the map not as parchment but as ground under hoof and boot. The west, Wales, the Severn Corridor, the long peninsula of Dumnonia, holds hills like clenched fists and coasts that complicate strangers. This is where a dux bellorum earns his keep, not by sitting a throne but by stitching valleys. He's less a crown than a schedule, less ceremony than circulation. Moving grain, news and men along lines Rome drew, and Britain refuses to forget. His household is a headquarters, not a court. It turns around a warband, Tulu in Welsh, bound by gift and oath, housed in timber halls that smell of wet cloaks and oiled wood. Their gear is practical, oval or round shields with bosses that have remembered many fists, spears, the tool that can be repaired by a smith with a hammer and a good tobacco cough, a few long swords, spathae from old legion stores or new work with Roman habits in the hilt, helmets scarce enough to be borrowed between cousins, mail the privilege of those whose names make lists, cloaks against weather, brooches against loss, belts heavy enough to carry a day's confidence. The sound in the yard is the sound of competence rehearsing, shield against shield, the grunt that sets a line, a horse snorting at the idea of standing still. Strategy begins with roads. The old Roman arteries are the island's remaining certainty. Watling Street from the southeast up toward the Midlands, the Fosse Way slanting across, the road that kisses the Severn and climbs to the borders of the hill kingdoms. A leader in the west does not try to hold every mile. He holds crossings, fords that can drown a careless column, causeways laid when emperors were still verbs, narrow necks where a day's march depends on a single ditch not being choked with last month's flood. Patrols run light, 4 or 5 mounted, javelins, a good eye for hedges, hoof marks are tided with a branch, fires left cold where scouts will look. Messages ride in pairs so one arrives. Signals are the island's fast language. Beacons on the ridges, bracken, brush, and a little lamp oil saved for the hour that matters, carry news farther than any shouting. From Cadbury to the Quantocks to the Black Mountains, a chain of small obediences stands ready. Light once, enemy near, twice, many, thrice, help already moving. A bell at a church on a hill counts the strokes for the valley before the smoke even clears. Monasteries serve as relay stations, scriptoria by day, dispatch posts by night, because monks know who can ride, and because a salter fits in a saddlebag when coin no longer does. Coin is thin, payment often clinks as brooches and arm rings, as cattle and grazing rights, as the promise of winter quarters with roofs that don't lie. A dux manages favours like a quartermaster manages grain. Careful notes, quiet interest, delivery on time. To hire Saxon or Frankish foederati for a season is sometimes cheaper than burying cousins. To release them before the harvest is sometimes the difference between a loyal village and a sullen one. He bargains, he remembers, he keeps his temper in rooms where other men perform theirs. The West lends itself to defence layered with ambush. Shield wall is the first layer, a palisade of men whose feet know the same rhythm. Spears reach, shields knit. The front rank holds until the rear rank's weight says now. A horn on the flank turns a line into an angle, presenting a hedge of points to a charge that expected soft ground. Behind that, the land fights for you. Bog where it looks like meadow, stone where it looks like soil. A handful of slingers on a knoll, boys who have hunted hares since they could run, put a surprising number of well-placed stones into faces that thought distance was safety. If the enemy collapses, pursuit is short and disciplined. Dead men's gear is useful. Dead men's friends tomorrow even more so. The order comes early. Back to the ford, count the living, send the names. Mounted work is glue. Britain does not field heavy cavalry in shining rank. It fields ponies with lungs and riders who can be at a gate before rumour. A dux keeps a string ready for messages and another for the short stab at a column strung out along a lane between hedges. Javelins thrown at the third file, not the first, turn a march into an argument. An argument turned at a river becomes a rout cut off at a bridge becomes a chance to trade surrender for service next year. Horses need shoes, shoes need iron needs a smith who likes you. Strategy is often hospitality in advance. Forts are not just last resorts, they are magazines and meeting places. South Cadbury's ramparts can hold a season's grain and a week's hope. Dinas Powys keeps a table and a treasury where hill princes can sulk and then sign. Caerleon, with its Roman bones, can stage a muster that impresses even men who prefer the smell of their own valleys. The dux rotates councils among such places so no petty king feels annexed and all feel attended. He brings a priest to bless the bread and a lawman to bless the bargain. He seats enemies so they pass the salt without spilling it. When voices rise, the harp gets louder. When voices soften, the scribe writes faster. Intelligence is made, not received. Women who trade cloth know which households can spare sons. Fishermen who watch estuaries know which sail shapes lie. Drovers know how many strangers moved through last fortnight and how much they paid for barley. A leader pays for such talk with attention and with small fairnesses. Disputes settled without insult. Toll reduced at the bridge for a widow. A promise kept about the miller's daughter's dowry. Information is a crop. You don't harvest where you never sowed. Campaigning has seasons. In spring, when roads firm and rivers swagger, raids test the edges. In summer, the enemy's grain stands hostage. Burn only what buys safety, not what purchases famine for neighbours. In autumn, marches must be short because carts stuck in clay eat hope. In winter, training and treaties replace travel. Halls host gefeo, feast work, where men learn to sit beside those they will stand beside, and oaths are said in the right order so they can be remembered in the dark. The duck spends winter like coin, sparingly, where warmth purchases loyalty that summer will need. Religion is a network as much as a solace. Bishops want peace enough to accept terms. Abbots want land surveyed enough to bless hedges. Saints' feasts gather scattered households into one listening. A leader lets the church speak where his voice would sound like command. A cross carved on a boundary stone does half the work of a patrol. When a campaign must pass through a saint's valley, he stops long enough to eat bread and leave a gift. Later, when letters must ride, the prior opens the gate before the knock. Law continues in the saddle. Blood feud can ruin a coalition faster than a lost skirmish. The dux binds compensation to the calendar and the kin group, counting cows and rings in public so memory cannot pretend later. He orders trials where honour can be saved without truth being bent. He makes examples rarely and early, and after that he makes arrangements. The aim is not spotless justice. It is workable peace between men who must share a ditch when rain comes. Tactics bend to ground. At a ford, the wall is shallow and wide, the points angle down to find shins. The reserve mounted to knife along the bank if the line buckles. In woods, files are 4 deep and the order is quiet. A horn means fall back, 2 means right, 3 means left, and everyone practices until a child can follow it. On a ridge, the front rank kneels with shield rims in turf. Slingers work from behind. A sudden step forward at the crest turns gravity into ally and fear into speed. Always a way out chosen before a way in. A victory that cannot be carried home is simply a story for someone else's fire. Diplomacy holds what battle wins. Saxon chieftains in the east and southeast do not arrive as a single storm. They arrive as weather fronts. One will trade for timber if the price includes dignity. Another wants grazing and a promise not to be attacked from the rear while he quarrels with his neighbour. A third only understands a demonstration. The Dux distinguishes, spares where sparing buys time, strikes where striking prevents the kind of confidence that breeds migration. He does not deceive himself that mercy will be remembered by all. He does count on enough remembering to matter. Logistics is the dull brilliance of the age. Grain tallies, cart axles greased with bear fat because it lasts, spare sandals, leather stitched in winter with waxed thread, spear shafts straightened over gentle heat and stored upright, salt enough to keep meat honest for 3 days' march, a line of cattle that can walk themselves to tomorrow's pot. Water, always a plan for water. The man who knows where the clean spring sits above the marsh is worth more than a hero in the wrong hour. And always reputation travels faster than flesh. The Dux's name walks in front of him, through markets and along hedges, over plank bridges and into halls. If his men pay at stalls, if they leave fences as they found them, if they lift a cartwheel for a stranger, his summons will stand when winter is mean. If they do not, his summons will meet silence dressed as misfortune. He knows this. He watches it like weather. He refuses the luxury of thinking strategy as arrows on a map. Strategy as people who, hearing a horn, choose to come. Set the scene, a damp dawn above the Severn. Mist holds hedges to their lines. A small company forms on a track where ruts remember legion wheels. The Dux speaks quietly because men hear better when no one shouts. He points, 2 fingers, never a fist, to the copse that hides the flank. He draws with his boot the angle at which the hedge becomes a wall. He taps a boy's shield and says, "Keep your right." Then he sends the first pair of riders to a ridge where a beacon waits for permission to matter. This is not empire. It is endurance arranged into action. It is Britain, Western and stubborn, deciding daily to be one thing long enough to survive becoming the next. Out of such decisions a leader, out of such leadership, the calm between invasions, out of that calm the space for monks to copy and farmers to harvest, for children to learn the 2 or 3 languages their island now needs. Call him Arthur or call him simply Dux, the work is the same. He is history's unglamorous gift to a people who needed time and took it. Set the year not by a single ink mark, but by a band of winters. Somewhere in the late 5th or very early 6th century, some reckonings say the 490s, others point a little past 500. A battle the island remembered as Mount Badon took place. Gildas, our sharp-tongued 6th century preacher, names it without naming its captain, Mons Badonicis, a day when the Britons, by the help of God, checked the advance of their foes and won a long reprieve. He speaks not like a court poet, but like a man taking stock of calamities and naming the one bright ledger entry that bought the island time. Later notes in the Welsh Annales Cambriae will pin Badon to a specific year and tie it to Arthur carrying the cross for 3 days and nights, a phrase that reads as liturgy stapled to memory. Between those witnesses lies the event's weight, a fight that halted a push and let a people breathe. Where was Badon? The land offers candidates the way a hedgerow offers blackberries. Several look right. Only one is the exact fruit you need. Many eyes turned to the west country around Bath, the old Roman city Aqua Sulis, where hot springs steam in winter and roads converge. Salisbury Hill, a steep knob just to the northeast, watches the Avons bend and commands approaches along Roman lines. A fight there would be natural, a hill to anchor a shield wall, a river to choke a column, a name close enough to Badon to satisfy ears that like tidy echoes. Others point to Badbury Rings in Dorset, a powerful Iron Age hill fort refortified in late antiquity, its triple ditches like a clenched fist on the chalk. There the Roman road net tangles and could be cut. Liddington Castle near the Ridgeway has its partisans too, standing above the old track like a shepherd over sheep. Each site offers height, roads, water, and archaeology that speaks of activity in our window. None carries an inscription saying "here." That is how the age is. Plausible ground, stubborn silence, a story that fits several ridges. What matters most is what the battle did, not merely where boots slipped and blades bit. Over the previous decades, Saxon and Angle settlements had taken root in the eastern lowlands, pushing lines, testing fords, probing hill edges. Some pushes were raids, some were colonisation, some were federate contingents hired by British leaders who then discovered that guests with spears are difficult to host. Against this slow pressure, the West and North organised defence. Patrols along Roman roads, hill forts strengthened, councils that could call men from several petty kingdoms to one fight. Badon is the hour when those preparations met a concentrated thrust and did not yield. Imagine the campaign in practical terms. A confederation gathers, Romano-British elites from the Severn and Avon country, hill kings from farther west, household retinues whose boots have memorised both turf and timber. Messages ride ahead of them along Watling Street's branches and the Fossways slant. Priests bless bread, smiths straighten spear shafts, cartwrights grease axles with bear fat because it lasts. The opposing host, drawn from eastern settlements and their allies, marches along the easiest lines a map offers. River valleys, ridgeways, old military roads that never forgot how to carry men. If they could take the Hinge, Bath's region or one of its analogues, the West would feel a door swing open behind it. Now set the ground. A hill steep enough to punish rashness, broad enough to hold a line. Below, a river bend that turns a retreat into a drowning if discipline fails. To one side, a Roman road where a column must either deploy or choke. To the other, rougher country where slingers and javelin men can harry flanks. The Britons arrive first, or, arriving second, choose not to charge but to occupy height and let the enemy discover gravity at sword length. Shields knit, spears angle, the front rank kneels with rims in turf, the second rank stands with points ready, the third listens for a horn. The order given in the yard, "keep your right," repeats itself down the line as position rather than speech. We will never know the day's tactics in detail, but the island's habits speak. A frontal assault against a tight shield wall on a slope is meat for gravity and discipline. The first rush jars, the second splinters some rims, the third meets a short forward surge from the crest. 3 paces down together, points out a shove that breaks breath and nerve. Sling stones thrown from flanking ground by boys who've killed rabbits all their lives find faces and hands. A horn on the British right signals a controlled wheel. The hedge of points becomes an angle. Attackers find themselves squeezed between iron and terrain. If the enemy tries the flanks, hedges and ditches learned in peacetime become weapons. If they pull back to deploy archers, the Britons hold because holding is victory whenever the clock favours you. Gildas says that after Badon there was a time of peace, long enough for children born under fear to become adults under reprieve. That is the strategic dividend. Badon did not end migrations or erase settlements. It did not cleanse the east of newcomers. It reset the rate of change. A checked advance meant fewer villages burned, more harvests gathered, more winters endured without flight. It meant councils that could be about hedges and marriage ties, rather than constantly about levies. It meant for a generation that the West and North might shape their own politics, instead of merely reacting to invasion. What of Arthur? Our earliest preacher leaves him unnamed. The 9th century Historia Brittonum gives him Badon and 11 other battles, calling him Dux Bellorum, the war leader. The 10th century annals plant his cross-bearing at Badon and his death at Camlann. Between these mentions stands a plausible career, a commander coordinating several polities, winning a decisive check, then losing later to civil fracture. It fits the shape of the age. It fits the logistics of a hill like Salisbury, or a ring like Badbury. It stays within Britain's labour. Roads, fords, councils, hill forts, short lines of supply, the dull brilliance of holding ground. Archaeology's contribution here is restraint and context. At Bath and around it, Roman infrastructure lingered. At South Cadbury, walls were rebuilt in our time window. At Badbury rings, late activity shows a fort not abandoned. At Liddington, position and trackways align with the needs of an army that wants a hinge. Shards and ditches do not say Arthur. They say someone cared to hold and feed men at scale. They say wagons came and went, cattle were driven, grain measured, gates repaired. They whisper logistics, the kind of whisper that carries farther than boast when storms come. Because later medieval writers, Geoffrey of Monmouth foremost, gild Badon into a stage for pageantry, it is useful here to hold the scene to earlier furniture. No banners with France in their dye, no imperial tours, no courtly contests, a rough hill under British sky, an army built from neighbouring valleys, weapons repaired on mobile anvils, a priest with a travel cross, a captain speaking Brittonic to the ranks and Latin to the clerics, a plan credible to men who have harvested as often as they have fought. That modesty makes the victory more believable and more beautiful. It is one thing to win with polished plate and a salaried guard. It is another to win with woven shields and borrowed mail while your cousin minds the barley. Aftermath matters. Commanders who win too hotly squander the benefit by pursuing glory into ambush. A good dux calls the recall early. The wounded are gathered. Names are counted. Carts loaded. Prisoners sorted. Those willing to swear service next year kept. Those bent on mischief traded for hostages. The dead are buried with the economy grief demands in wartime. Shallow graves on the lee slope. Stones placed. A promise made to families by men who will ride with letters later. The march away is as disciplined as the stand. Villages along the road see men who pay for bread and do not trample hedges. Reputation consolidates the tactical win into a political one. And then the dividend unfurls. Forts are repaired without haste. Monks copy, perhaps in better light. Children learn both their Brittonic and their Latin prayers. Trade breathes along the western seaways. Amphorae arrive. A carved stone goes up on a boundary with both scripts to make the claim intelligible across tongues. Young men who would have died at 25 marry at 20 and hold their first child at 23. That is strategy's real currency, years bought back from crisis. Camlann, when it comes later, will break the coalition. Plague, when it loops across the island, will make the marrow ache. But between Badon and that darker ledger, a span of life sits, long enough for a boy to remember that his father once came home from a battle the island could feel in its bones. That memory seeds the legend. Not because poets needed a giant, but because villages needed a name attached to relief. Arthur, if he was the ducks, earned it. If another bore the office then, memory pinned the name to the role because the role deserved a hero. So keep the picture local. Ridge, river, road. A hill chosen for work, not drama. A wall of men who trusted the voice 2 ranks down. An enemy stopped short of a hinge that would have unmade the West. A preacher, decades later, still scolding, conceding that once, the island did what it had to and it held. That is Badon shape. A hard check, a quiet victory, a pocket of time in which Britain remembered itself. Keep the blade local, for storytellers polished the edges, before courts abroad amplified the gleam. The sword we call Excalibur lived at home under a Welsh name, Caledfwlch, Caeled, hard, plus Bwlch, breach or gap. Hard breach, a tool that opens what will not open, a cut that turns a standstill into a passage. The name fits the island's work after Rome. Fords forced, shield walls split, quarrels resolved with a clarity only iron could argue. Later, Latinizing scribes would write Caliburnus, and later still the familiar Excalibur would settle in English mouths. But the earliest sound of it is Brittonic, shaped by hills that hold the last echo longer than the first shout. Sources keep it on British ground. In the native tales, Caerleon and Olwyn foremost, Arthur presides over a British court stocked with Brittonic companions whose names still smell of the west wind. See Kai, Bedwer, Bedivere, Gwalchmai, Gawain. The business is boars, giants, and difficult errands threaded through Welsh place names. In the enigmatic poem Prydiw Annwfn, The Spoils of Annwfn, Arthur sails to another world reached by British waters. The treasure is won by craft, courage, and a captain who belongs to the island's geography. None of this needs foreign ornament. The sword's aura grows out of rivers, fords, and lakes, the audience knew by foot and ferry. Archaeology underwrites the habit that makes a lady of the lake make sense to British ears, weapons given to water. Long before sub-Roman warbands, island peoples were sinking prestige blades, shields, and spears deliberately into rivers and meres. The Thames has yielded pattern-welded swords and fittings that once flashed in sun before they learned silt. The Witham has given up a famously inlaid blade. The Severn and its tributaries quietly hold iron that once belonged to pride. In Wales, lake edge finds and hoards from earlier ages, think of Lyn Cerrig Bach on Anglesey for the practice in principle, even if centuries apart, show the long memory of water as witness. To dedicate a weapon to a river or lake is to close its account honourably. No theft, no squabble over airship, no slow decay on a rack. Only a clean surrender to a keeper everyone respects. When later storytellers speak of a hand from the water receiving a king's sword, they are not inventing a custom, they are dramatising one. What kind of blade would Caledfwlch have been in the century after Rome withdrew? Likely not a short Roman gladius of earlier legions, but a longer spather-type sword, two-edged, around 70-90 centimetres, meant for cut and competent thrust, the sort late Roman cavalry favoured and sub-Roman elites copied. Britain's smiths, drawing on inherited Roman technique and local craft, could produce pattern-welded cores, twisted iron rods forge-welded together, bordered by harder steel edges, yielding a blade both resilient and keen. Such patterning is not only decorative, it manages the island's iron, tough where it must flex, hard where it must bite. Hilt forms would be practical, organic grips of horn or wood, guards modest, pommels sized for control rather than theatre. A king's blade earned notice by performance first. Decoration followed use, not the other way around. If the sword is the headline, the scabbard is the policy. Later British redactions, Mallory among them, remember that Arthur's scabbard had the better magic. While worn, wounds bled less or not at all. That tidy moral is island sensible. The blade wins, the scabbard preserves. In real terms, a tight waxed leather sheath over wood, fitted with a well-made chape and throat, keeps edge and body safe from damp and accident. A good baldric keeps hands free for reins and signals. A well-stayed mouth prevents panic in a fall. A commander who can keep his men alive through small discipline buys more victory than a showman who slashes brilliantly and then loses half his line to infection. In story logic, the scabbard's virtue is simply an honest praise of logistics. The greatest defence is to never need the sword. Let the quiet vigilance of Camelot settle over your thoughts now, guarding your rest. If this journey through the heart of Britain is guarding your sleep, a gentle like or a quiet subscription is the oath that helps more souls find peace on the round table. Rest now. The king keeps watch. 2 acquisition stories grew in Britain and stayed British in meaning even as language shifted. The first is the sword from the stone, or from an anvil on a stone, a test of rightness more than strength. Within an island that had watched councils fracture and coalitions strain, a sign that cut through faction had value. Let the land itself adjudicate. The earliest clear version of this motif reaches us through Anglo-Norman writing on British soil in the High Middle Ages, but it is told as a British sign for a British throne. The second story is the sword from the lake, authority conferred and crucially revocable by the island's waters. That strand harmonises perfectly in the deposition custom, and with a kingship that must answer to the land as much as to men. A blade drawn from water is not merely found, it is leased from a trust older than any court. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century within the Anglo-Norman world of Britain, gives us Caliburnus, forged in the Isle of Avalon. Not a continent away, but a British otherwhere whose entrance is open locally. Marsh islands, apple places, mists that keep secrets. Later Englishing will make Caliburnus into Excalibur, but the line of descent is island straight. Caledfwlch, Caliburnus, Excalibur, the sound shifting with scribes while the meaning keeps its edge. Through these tellings, the sword remains British property, even when French poets polish the handle. The water that grants and the hand that receives are those of British lakes the audience could point to with a shepherd's crook. Names around the sword keep us at home. Bedwyr, later Bedivere, is Welsh long before he's English. When he casts the sword back in the island's telling, the lake replies with a sign British hearers already trusted. A hand, neither monstrous nor divine in foreign dress, but the plain miracle of a rightful return. Gwalchmai, Gawain, and Ser, Kai, circulate in the earliest Welsh tales. Their presence beside the blade roots the episode in native company. Even when Anglo-Norman chroniclers write, they write for British halls that know where the good fords are and why a scabbard matters. If the question is symbol, Britain supplies the context without borrowing metaphysics it does not use. A king's sword on this island is less a sacrament of conquest than a covenant of competence. The one who bears it must carve space for law to sit, at Cadbury's long bench or Caerleon's redressed Roman walls. The edge is permission to open stubborn things, blockaded roads, locked granaries in famine, closed mines in council. The return of the sword to water in the end, whether after Camlann or at any grey ford where the tale prefers to place remorse, asserts that tools which serve the common peace do not retire to private walls. They go back to the people's oldest vault. the island itself. Material culture keeps offering footnotes. Inscribed stones of the 5th, 6th centuries, Latin on one face, Ogham on the edge, remind us that elites who might carry such a sword lived bilingual lives. Refortified hill forts in that same window tell us where such a blade would be belted on to ride out. Timbered gates, fresh ditches, halls with stores and scribes. Sevenside trade in amphorae hints at feasts where the sword lay across the knees of a host who could pour wine and justice with equal steadiness. In such rooms, the talk about a blade would be precise. Who forged it? Who witnessed its best work? Who has seen the scabbard's stitching? Who is owed the first right to lift it in the morning if the captain does not rise? Legend grows thickest where daily usefulness is densest. Even the etymology cooperates with British work. Caledfwlch does not flatter, it evaluates. Hard breach could be praise for a gate ram or an argument that finally cuts through dithering. When later romance spreads brocade on the hilt, the Welsh root sits underneath like timber under paint. English ears, hearing Excalibur, still carry an echo of the original hardness and the function. Not glory for its own sake, but the opening of what must be opened so communities can keep their agreements. You can walk this meaning into the land, stand on a bridge over the Avon or the Usk, and watch iron water fold and unfold under a pale sky. A king who claims a blade from such a place isn't stealing wonder. He's being entrusted with a community's sharpest commons. He must wield it against enemies with measure, and harder, against friends' temptations with mercy. When his hour closes, as all hours do, the water that once granted takes back. The hand that rises is the people's memory dressed as a sign. It lifts once, cleanly, and the blade is gone from trouble. So let the story remain insular without being small. Caledfwlch begins where Brittonic and Roman habits met in timber halls and on Roman roads. Caliburnus is the same blade with a Latin tongue. Excalibur is the English name for the island's old agreement that edge serves order. The two acquisition scenes, Stone and Lake, are both British judgments, one public and civil, one sacred and geographic. The scabbard's praise keeps logistics honest, Bedwere's throw keeps kings honest, and the water keeps the final ledger, because in Britain the land always has the last word, and sometimes it speaks with a hand. Courts need roofs before they need romances. If a war leader is to be more than a sprint between crises, he must have a place where grain is counted, oaths are spoken, and quarrels can cool without swords being consulted. Later poets call that place Camelot and furnish it with pendants and pageantry. Earlier Britain furnishes something plainer and more believable. Halls that work. Names gather around them. Caerleon on Usk, South Cadbury in Somerset, a handful of other strong places where a dux could lay a board, call for stools, and turn scattered loyalties into an afternoon's policy. Begin on the river Usk, in the shadow of Rome's old frame. Caerleon, Isca Augusta, was a legionary base before legionaries became memory. By the 5th and 6th centuries, its stones still stood where timber had not yet learned the trick of replacing it. An amphitheatre squatted like a patient bowl. Walls showed their backs to weather. A bathhouse, if not hot, could at least be dry. For an island rediscovering the wattled wall and the thatched idea, such Roman leftovers were a ready-made dignity. A leader who could summon chiefs to a place with gates heavier than insult would do so. When Geoffrey of Monmouth, centuries later, seats Arthur's court here, he is not importing a fantasy so much as underlining a practicality. Caerleon looks like a capital because it has the bones. Travel southwest to the high Somerset shelf, where the land steps up and looks around. South Cadbury is a hill fort with a view and an attitude. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, our window, the ramparts were massively refortified, gateways rebuilt with timber in the Roman style, an internal street plan laid, and a large timber hall raised near the summit. Sherds of imported amphorae and fine tablewares turned up in the digs like footnotes. Wine from the west, oil and luxuries arriving along the Severn Sea. A host who could pour the good stuff as well as command. If you want a British court with a working pantry and a strategic map under its floorboards, Cadbury obliges. Scholars have long whispered its claim to Camelot not as proof, but as permission to imagine a court that fits the evidence, a defended headland of authority above good roads and reachable valleys. Other sites keep the argument honest. Wroxeter, Viraconium, in the Severn Plain taught timber how to sit inside stone. Late Roman streets and bath buildings converted into a kind of hybrid town, where a timber hall rose against a rubble basilica, and people who remembered scripts moved among people who remembered fields. Tintagel on Cornwall's Atlantic shelf married peril and prestige. Cliff castles with Mediterranean pottery, a court that could receive by sea what roads could not deliver without trouble. Dinas Powys near the Taff mouth shows a defended court with metalworking and feasting refuse, elites eating well and arming better. None of these declares here only. Together they describe the type, court as nodal fortress on a road net, with stores, scribes and signal lines to allies. What did a day look like in such a place? Morning begins with gates opening as if the hill drew a breath. Pack animals arrive from the outfields, bales of wool and sacks of grain set in the counting yard. A steward chalks the ledger board, counters click, a boy reads numbers aloud so mistakes are shared and therefore fewer. The kitchen smokes, geese argue with purpose. A line of messengers takes shelter under the eaves, the one from the north streaked with peat, the one from the coast salt-scruffed, each with news sized to their road. The Dux appears not with trumpets, but with a nod to the gate guard who held the night, and with a question for the steward that proves he remembers the last tally. The hall itself is both theatre and workshop. Its long table serves as desk, altar and map. Along one wall hang shields, their bosses polished, their leather oiled, ready to be lifted for demonstrations as well as for war. A scribe sits under the brighter slit window with a board across his knees, copying or composing in Latin for letters and in the local tongue for effect. A priest, sometimes two, keeps an eye on tempers as on souls. When envoys arrive, they are seated according to the day's geometry, rivals separated by a bowl of pears, kin set so they must pass bread before they pass words. The famous round table of later telling is a polite dream of equality. The earlier practice is humbler and sharper. No head seat monopolises prestige, but there is still a rhythm to where veterans and princes share benches so that counsel circulates instead of pooling. Law sits at the table after bread, not because bread softens, but because hunger hardens folly. A boundary dispute between two parishes is untangled with stakes and strings on the floor. A bride price is set at a rate that gives dignity without inviting ruin. A complaint against a steward is heard in a voice that knows stewards are the gravity between orders and outcomes. The Dux speaks little and asks the lawman, often a grey figure with memories of Roman order and British stubbornness, to make the speech that binds. The decision is hung on a visible thing, a marked staff, a knotted cord, so memory cannot pretend later it misheard. War counsel follows with fewer ears in the room. A wax tablet carries a sketch of ridge and ford. The edge of the platter marks the curve of a lane. crumbs stand for forts, an overturned cup for a hill where a beacon will sit tonight if consent can be won. Here Caerleon's stone and Cadbury's height both serve. Men look out or imagine outward, and strategy feels local because it is. The ducks apportions tasks by competence, not romance. The loud assent where noise helps. The precise, where a narrow lane will decide a season. He asks for numbers and gets them, because he has learned to prefer an honest small pledge to an inflated large one that fails when the cart breaks a wheel. Afterward, the scribe pins the plan to short sentences and proper names, so no one rides away armed, only with enthusiasm. Afternoons belong to craft and quiet power. In the smithy, iron sings its work. Spearheads line a board like teeth drying. The smell of charcoal holds the day steady. A goldworker repairs a brooch with a steadiness that kings envy. On the practice green just below the rampart, pairs move through shield drills that look dull and will save lives. In the women's yard, accounts are taught to daughters. Weights, measures, exchange, and hospitality's mathematics are explained. How many loaves per bench? How much salt per barrel? What a shortage smells like 2 weeks early, and how to buy it off with a gift to the right household. Court is here at its most capital function. It teaches. The road will carry those lessons back down into valleys until the island is knitted more by habits than by orders. As light slants, ritual and story share the room. A priest or bishop, British, not Roman prefect, blesses the hall with a psalm, and the shock of Latin sits handsomely beside the hum of Brittonic speech. A skald or bard tunes his harp and makes the day digestible. Names of those who pledged, humour at those who overspoke. A verse for the young messenger who fell asleep on his feet with the steward's chalk still in his hair. The song tells truth without starting a feud. The room agrees to this economy. In such moments, the later fantasy of Camelot is a neat embroidery on an honest cloth. What matters is not marvel but manners turned into memory. Why does Camelot as a name hold, then, when the island supplies several candidates? Because the idea is portable and necessary. Camelot is the concept of a court that gathers law, logistics and loyalty into one weatherproof place. Geoffrey's Caerleon has Roman dignity, South Cadbury has sub-Roman vigour. Other sites supply variations. The label floats because the function travels. A ducks might hold spring at Cadbury, summer councils at Caerleon, autumn stores at Roxeter, winter refuge near Tintagel, each season's Camelot being where the tasks fit best. The later singular name is a poet's shorthand for a rotating circuit of capitals. Keep the picture insular. We need no foreign tourneys or borrowed coats of arms to make this court impressive. A boundary stone cut with Latin on one face and Ogham on its edge does more to prove culture than a tent full of silks. A granary stacked to the rafters is finer than a brocade saddle. A gate that swings true in rain is an argument for kingship stronger than any trumpet. And nothing in these courts contradicts the sword we already kept British. Caledfwlch lying on a trestle while the scabbard dries by the hearth. Later in the evening the blade lifted for a witness. By this edge we open the road at the ford and set down again before the bread is cut. The court's limits are as important as its strengths. Halls cannot be everywhere, roads wash out, retinues need winter. Faction creeps even into well-seated rooms. A dux who plays one valley's pride against another quarrel may win a stanza and lose a coalition. A queen's alliance, we will come to Guinevere soon, can stabilise a bench or tilt it. A steward grown too clever can sour a parish against levy. These halls are not enchanted, they are managed. Their miracle, if we must have one, is simply continuity. a ledger that matches last month's, a gate that opens to the right knock, a council that adjourns before anger but after agreement. Night falls. The hill holds a small constellation of coals. Down in the yards, dogs name the passing hours more honestly than sundials. The last messenger rides out with letters wrapped in waxed leather and a hunk of cheese in his pouch. On the rampart walk, 2 sentries trade the only gossip that matters, weather and hoofbeats. Inside, the hall sleeps in the knowledge that tomorrow it must be caught again. Camelot in function if not in name, because a country that has been left by empire survives by places that work. Whether you stand on the Usk's cold bend or Cadbury's windy crown, you can feel why the story keeps returning to a capital. Britain needed one, and when it could not keep just one, it invented a word that honoured every hill where law and supper shared a fire. Keep her on the island and call her by the name Britain first used, Gwenhwyfar in Welsh tradition, later Guinevere in English retellings. She's not a foreign princess smuggled in by pageant. She's a British queen whose marriage sits at the centre of law, land and loyalty. In an age that has mislaid emperors and must make do with councils, a queen is a hinge. She binds houses that might otherwise quarrel, keeps hospitality honest, and turns a chieftain's good luck into a kingdom's durable habit. When later poems embroider romance onto her sleeves, remember the cloth beneath: kinship, property, diplomacy, and the hard work of making many tables feel like one. Begin with names and roots. Welsh sources keep Gwenhwyfar close to home, her name moving through triads and tale lists as a figure whose presence implies status and settlement. The later English Guinevere wears French polish, but the older syllables sit better against British hills. In a sub-Roman court, the Queen's pedigree is policy. She arrives with land claims, foster ties and oath strings that can be pulled without drawing a sword. Marriage is not a pageant, it is a treaty with songs. When a dux bellorum like Arthur seeks to turn a coalition into a commonwealth, the bride he chooses must already know the island's ledger. Who owes cattle? Who owes silence? Who owes the courtesy of arriving sober to council? Queenship in 5th and 6th century Britain is economy before spectacle. The Queen controls hospitality, and hospitality is logistics wearing manners. She orders the granaries, how much can be spent on a week of guests without putting autumn at risk. She keeps the salt count. Meat travels farther when cured. She knows the kitchen lanes like a captain knows fords. Her steward reports to her. Her cellarer consults her before the cup runs generous. Her spinning houses answer her tally of flax and wool. A hall that feeds without waste and welcomes without debt is a political instrument, and the Queen tunes it daily. When rival princes arrive under truce, the way the benches are set and the first loaves go out is argument. The Queen makes it. She also keeps gift exchange clean, and gifts speak clearer than sermons. In a land where coin is thin, rings, brooches, cloak pins and cups carry promises. The Queen chooses who receives what and why. An arm ring to a border captain who brought his levy on time. A brooch to the sister of a man the court needs sober. A good cloak to a bard whose verses cool quarrels. These are not trinkets, they are portable contracts. Each thing has provenance. The Queen remembers it, repeats it at the handover, and thereby writes the gift into community memory. Later, when someone tests the hall's patience, she has a shelf of objects that can be pointed to as reminders. We gave you this on the day we asked that road to stay open. Kinship is her other ledger. She knows the web of cousins that crosses mountains better than the captains do. She tracks fosterage. the custom that sends children to be raised in allied households and treats it as a quiet insurance policy. Foster siblings forgive what soldiers will not. A queen arranges those placements matching tempers and temperaments, sending a hot-blooded boy to a cool valley and a shy girl to a loud hall, so both will learn useful courage. When feuds flare, she can call in favours from mothers and foster mothers who neither forget nor forgive lightly. This is not embroidery. It is the island's circuitry. Law sits in her lap as often as on a man's tongue. At bride price and dowry hearings, the Queen's word is measurement. A dowry too small insults, one too large unbalances districts. She knows what land comes with her person, what rents follow it, and how to keep woman's property distinct from the king's so that, if the worst happens, her mourning gift and jointure can continue feeding the people who depended on her. When the court arbitrates inheritance, brothers, half-brothers, sons by different mothers, the Queen's calm enumeration prevents blood from outrunning reason. Sometimes she is the only voice that can remind all present that a child's future should not be decided by yesterday's anger. Do not imagine she never walks the yard where spears are mended. Queens in this era often manage mustering as surely as mead pouring. Before a campaign, she oversees the issue of rations, checks that cart tack is sound, and insists that pack horses are swapped before the weak become losses. She walks the infirmary with the healer, learning where linen is short and honey is low. In the hour after battle, when names must be counted and messages written, a queen's presence orders grief. She sets aside a bench for those who will rage, and another for those who will weep, and she keeps both from hindering the tally. The island remembers such composure longer than it remembers a bright strike. The church learns to work with her because she understands holy days as logistics. Feasts gather villages that otherwise drift. The Queen chooses which saint's day will double as market day, which vigil will invite oath renewals beside the altar. Bishops enjoy peace enough to copy books. Queens enjoy bishops who can speak to multiple valleys at once. When a sanctuary claim threatens justice, she is often the one who finds a humane compromise. Penance that looks like public service. Restitution that lands before winter. What of love, scandal, and the late romance's favourite disaster? Keep the story within Britain and within probability. A high-status marriage is political first. Affection may follow, and often does, because proximity and competence learn to admire each other. Where Lancelot will later step in as a French mirror for longing, the earlier island has enough tension at home. Rivalries within the warband, loyalties split between kin and king, faction that tempts a nephew or cousin to make a bid. Guinevere danger, if we must name one, lies less in imported adultery than in the strain of coalition politics. The Queen trapped between kin obligations and the court's needs. A single misjudged gift, a patronage that slights a necessary captain, a dowry that shifts a boundary by a half-day's walk, these can bruise a realm. A good queen mends quickly, admits plainly, and buys forgiveness with accuracy. We were wrong there, we pay thus, we will not err twice. Notice too how queenship outlives campaigns. A king rides, a queen stays where letters land. In plague years and lean years, her hall becomes distribution point and memory house. Who ate last week? Who sleeps near the hearth? Who must not be turned away when the door is crowded? She keeps winter stories moving, the ones that remind children who they are and remind soldiers what they're for. In such seasons, a queen's quiet accounting is nobler than any banner. She keeps names alive. Guinevere's presence also shapes the idea of court. Later ages will polish that idea into Camelot's round courtesy, The earlier age needs fewer metaphors and more chairs. Where she sits, petitioners feel the room has room for them. Where she stands during judgment, men hear the sentence as household truth, not merely command. Where she hands the cup, the oath spoken over it keeps. In a world where written law is scarce and seals are fragile, custom is king and the queen is custom's voice, consistent, audible, remembered. Her ending, like Arthur's, must stay in Britain. If the coalition breaks at Camlann, the queen's task is survival with dignity, securing hostages, carrying archives, placing orphans, retiring to a house of prayer or to kin who can keep the hall's human promises when the hall itself must be abandoned. Monastic tradition will sometimes draw a queen into cloister after catastrophe. Lay custom will sometimes keep her at a family elis, court, where her dower lands shelter the remnant. Either way, island continuity is the point. The woman who kept benches even keeps a little kingdom warm until the next roof can be raised. So hold Guinevere steady, neither idle nor scandal. She is a British queen whose intelligence is practical, whose virtue is accuracy, and whose power is the routine excellence that turns alliances into a country. If Arthur buys Britain time with a victory like Badon, Guinevere spends that time wisely. Granaries balanced, quarrels cooled, daughters fostered, gifts remembered, altars timed to markets, law seated near bread. Legends later will ask whether the king was worthy of the queen or the queen of the king. Britain's older truth is simpler. The island needed both kinds of competence, edge that opened stubborn things, and hands that keep what was opened from falling apart. Before it was a symbol polished by poets, Arthur's company was a working unit with muddy boots and clear jobs. In the 5th and 6th centuries, a leader's household in Britain was his Tulu, a warband bound by oath, fed by the court's granaries, and expected to ride when fires on the ridges spoke. These men, sometimes kin and sometimes carefully chosen strangers, drilled to hold a lane, screen a retreat, escort grain, and make a stand on the kind of hill where a handful can delay a crowd. Their prestige ran on usefulness. The harp praised bright feats at night, but dawn remembered who kept watch in sleet, who shared salt without counting, and who knew the ford's bottom by heart. The later word knight arrived centuries on, wearing armour cut to a different fashion. The shape of duty, though, is already here, mounted when needed, answerable to an oath, and measured as much by steadiness as by speed. Names we meet later, under French spellings, breathe Welsh and Brittonic first. Gwalchmai before Gawain, Bedwyr before Bedivere, Say before Kay. In the native tales, these companions are not chess pieces on a tourney field. They're men with particular talents that suit Britain's ground. Craft at the javelin, a good eye for tracks, the stubborn patience to hold a crossroad until counsel catches up. When a hall like Cadbury or a town remade from Roxeter's bones called its best a table, the company that answered looked less like a parade and more like a map of the island. Upland riders, lowland slingers, riverine scouts, law-wise elders who could keep pride from spending tomorrow's strength. The circle they form around their captain is first a reach of hands, a practical perimeter long before it is a ring of chairs. The idea that later hardens into the round table begins, plausibly, as habit. A war leader who needs rival captains to listen will not place one man forever at his right. He will shift seating to distribute attention, turn benches into shared stages, and trim the head of table ritual until counsel travels rather than pools. The table's geometry matters because it teaches the mouth where to send its words. Equality in this age is not ideology, it is craft. Arrange a room so that necessary men hear each other and leave less bitter than they arrived. The bards notice the pattern and praise it. The church approves of the tempering of pride. Later writers, needing a symbol that travels faster than the detail of bench plans, call it round and let the shape preach for them. From this working circle come oaths short enough to memorize and hard enough to matter. Protect the weak who stand under the hall's law. Keep faith once pledged, whether to king, kin or guest right. Take no profit from famine or fear. Refuse a fight that profits only wrath. Ride when the beacons ask. Pay for bread when the baker cannot spare it. Leave hedges as you found them. These are not lines for pageant. They're rules that keep levy from becoming looting and turn a feared warband into a welcome patrol. A captain who enforces them purchases more intelligence than coin could buy, because farmers talk to men who do not trample turnips. In time, the oaths gather ornaments, courtesy to ladies, mercy to fallen foes, justice before glory. But their bone stays British. A company that behaves so roads remain useful. As centuries pass and monasteries bind stories into books, the Tulu is remembered through the lens of the High and later Middle Ages. Mail deepens, helms lengthen, horses grow heavier on the page than they ever were on most British fields. And the word knight comes to mean a mounted elite trained not only for war, but for a civil style that seats the sword at law's table. Britain's own churchmen and courtiers do much of this polishing. Geoffrey of Monmouth gives the court Roman bones at Caerleon. Wace adds the roundness to the table. Layerman brings it into English. Welsh tale cycles keep the company loud, local and vivid. The code they fashion is not imported whole from elsewhere so much as edited at home. The island takes its native expectation, that strength serve neighbours, and clothes it in the manners of an age that values liturgy, letters and ceremony. Tournaments, when they appear in later British life, are rehearsals of control more than pavilions of vanity. They take the old drills, charge, wheel, recover, shield touch without malice, lance at a mark rather than at a man, and stage them, so lords learn to spend heat without burning their own fields. The church frowns when waste and death attend. The court trims the forms until practice becomes pageant safely. Even then, the island's ground keeps the show honest. A tilt run on damp turf teaches humility quickly. A broken girth or a tired horse reminds everyone that the smithy, the saddler, and the stable are truer sources of glory than a banner. The knightly becomes acceptable to Britain insofar as it remains serviceable to Britain. Within the stories, the companions keep their Brittonic textures. Gwalchmai's courage is often daylight courage, strong when the sun is honest and the cause plain. Bedwyre's last task by the water, returning the king's blade to the lake, is not a trick but a civic act, relinquishing what belongs to the land. Sayre's rough tongue, a native feature of the Welsh tales, becomes in later Englishing a crankiness the hall tolerates because the man turns up where trouble needs endurance. Percival arrives by way of Welsh tradition as a country boy learning how to be useful without losing the accuracy of his gaze. Even Lancelot, when he finally enters from French romance, must be domesticated by British hills to last here, his grandeur trimmed to make room for the island's suspicion of greatness that forgets kitchens. Chivalry's famous courtesies, saluting the worthy foe, lifting the fallen, speaking gently to petitioners, do not contradict the older economy. They narrate it for an age that writes more. The Queen's influence runs through these manners. A Gwenhwyfar who keeps benches fair also keeps tempers plausible. She can turn a boast into a vow by asking for the details. Which road? Whose escort? How many days' salt? She can turn a feud into a contest by setting a test at the ford or on the butts, measuring outcome before anger grows teeth. The men around the table become knightly not by learning tricks of compliments, but by learning how to make their strength easy for neighbours to live beside. The Round Table's courtesy is therefore not foreign gloss, it is domestic policy expressed as behaviour. The Church adds a stern sweetness. Sermons lay Scripture's cadence over the warrior's oath, and make of mercy a binding clause. A bishop reading the Beatitudes in a hall that smells of oak smoke can persuade a captain that sparing a village buys prayers that hold a flank as surely as spears. Confession introduces the habit of examining motives. Penance offers an honourable exit from errors that could otherwise calcify into feuds. Pilgrimage turns travel into discipline. Relics and shrines become waypoints on routes a patrol would ride anyway. In this way, Britain baptizes the warband's old virtues: loyalty, restraint, truthful speech, and sets them in a calendar so they repeat. All the while, the code remembers mud. Knights, whatever we call them, remain valuable only insofar as they can read sky and ground. They must know when turf will take a horse and when it will swallow it, when a levy should be sent home to save the harvest, when a hungry ally is more dangerous than a declared enemy, when a fine blow is worse than a well-timed silence. The Round Table keeps a chair for the man who says wait at the right hour. It keeps another for the woman who has the ledger in her head and can tell the room whether the oaths it wants to make are payable in grain and labour. It keeps another for the priest who reminds the brave that pride sinks boats. A circle that cannot seat these truths is decoration. A circle that does becomes government. By the time Mallory knits the island's telling in the 15th century, the company has become a mirror Britain uses to inspect itself. Are we brave without being cruel, loyal without being blind, pious without being foolish, courteous without being false? He sets the questions in English that remembers both court and common field. The failure at the end, Camlann, the fellowship broken, is not proof that the code was wrong. It is proof that human hands, even when trained by the best tables, shake. The story keeps the hope anyway in its oldest Brittonic phrasing, once and future. Not a promise of a foreign saviour, but a reminder that when Britain needs the circle of service again, it knows from memory how to lay the boards, count the loaves, sharpen the oaths, and ask the right men and women to sit. Annals do not weep, they point. The Welsh Annales Cambriae, in a hand from the 10th century drawing on older notes, lays down 2 pins without embroidery. Under one year, Badon victory, under another Camlann, in which Arthur and Madrout fell, and there was great mortality in Britain and Ireland. No motive, no map, no catalogue of banners, just the fact of a fight and the taste of a season that ended badly. Between those 2 pins are lifetime stretches, the breathing space bought at Badon and spent across councils, roads, and winters. Camlann marks the bill coming due. Keep it within Britain and within probability. The word Camlann itself behaves like a place name, shaped by Welsh mouths. Cam, bent, with a second element argued over. Lanr, tide. Glen, or remembered stream. Scholars have offered sites without insisting. The Camel Valley near Camelford in Cornwall, where tradition later planted an echo. A northern candidate along the wall country where Roman names, Camberglana among them, might have weathered into a similar sound. A Welsh stream valley whose old name is lost between hedges and new farms. Each offers believable ground. A ford, a ridge, a constricted lane where allies turned obstacles. None carries the certain label. That ignorance is honest. The age is like that. What, then, can be said with the island's evidence? First, Medrawt, later Mordred in romance, appears in the earliest note not as a horned villain, but as a name beside Arthur's in the clause in which Arthur and Medrawt fell. The grammar does not assign blame. It records coincidence or collision. Read locally and soberly. This suggests a fracture within a confederation. Kin or near kin on opposed benches. Factions that once shared a winter store now counting each other as obstacles. Oaths frayed by strain. The causes that pull such coalitions apart are not exotic. They are the island's daily hazards made large. Succession, when a war leader's authority must cross from hand to hand without the Roman habit of a bureaucracy to bear it. Patronage, when a steward's fairness is doubted and district pride begins to shop for new friends. Fatigue, after years of readiness that dulls esprit and sharpens envy. Second, the timing fits a harsher ledger the annals also keep. Pestilence and lean across the 530s and 540s. Mortality notes appear. Whether from plague or hunger's delegates, years arrive that bend tempers. Such seasons magnify grudges. Grain shortens. Levies resent being kept from fields. Captains nurse injuries into arguments. Bishops, overworked, begin to speak in tones that make laymen prickly. A leader with Arthur's stature, if he lived into such weather, would be forced to govern more scarcity than warfare. The arts of peace, equitable rationing, fair market days, limits on foraging, win no songs, they say futures. Failure there breeds the quiet angers that burst loud when steel arrives. Third, the military shape of a breaking coalition looks like Camlann is said to look, a battle with both champions lost. That outcome implies proximity, enemies within reach who know the same roads, who can arrive at the same ford at the same hour because their beacon nets overlap, who understand the other side's drills because they share an instructor's ancestry. This is civil war's signature. Tactics that cancel as mirrors cancel, followed by costs that feel like a family dividing plates. The annals phrase great mortality may point as much to aftermath as to the field. Retaliations, famine spread by burned stores, sickness that follows crowds without bread. Set out the likely prelude in British rooms, a winter council where the benches look familiar but the glances do not. A matter of succession, sons, nephews, fosterlings, where law can advise but not compel. A dower land boundary where the Queen's ledger and a cousin's memory disagree by a day's walk. A captain slighted in public who bristles just long enough for his household to take the cue. A bishop who counsels patience and is called partial. None of this needs melodrama. It needs only 2 or 3 wrong words at the wrong bread ale. The island's politics are personal because it states a person's first. Lords and ladies whose domains are their kitchens and gates. When confidence thins, correction must be swift, visible and fair. If it isn't, retinues harden along loyalty lines, and the circuit of capitals, Cadbury, Caerleon, Roxeter, becomes a map of rival itineraries. Now the field. Choose ground that can be reached by the same logic from opposite sides. A ford where carts must cross, a lane between hedges that forces files to narrow, a saddle between hills where beacon tells beacon what both already see, dawn thick with river breath, lawmen muttering, priests separating hotheads, veterans checking straps, the first hour messy because neither side wants to be the side that struck first, the second hour decisive because restraint breaks under the weight of insult accumulated over months. Shield lines form with the ease of muscle memory, javelins fold the space between, slingers look grim in the knowledge that they may be hitting cousins' friends. No trumpet summons a cavalry that does not exist in panoply here. Ponies slither along flanks with messengers and the short, ugly thrusts that make or unmake a line. A horn calls a wheel that both learned from the same teacher. The manoeuvre cancels. The battle degenerates into close work where command is more about being seen than being heard. In such press, leaders expose themselves because there is no other way to steady the men who can still think. If Arthur is present, he will be at the point where steadiness buys an hour. If Madreot holds the other hinge, he will be within sight, kin features recognised even through sweat and iron. A surge, a collapse, the kind of accident that history later turns into fate. A stumble at a turf seam, a misread banner, a horn blown an instant off. Death finds both. Rumour finds the camps before the bodies cool. The afterwork of Camlann would be the true disaster. A coalition loses the broker who turned feasts into treaties. The second figure, the one named beside him, falls too, removing the rival whose defeat might have unified the rest. With both poles down, centrifuge takes over. Retinues withdraw to their hills and estuaries. Caerleon's Roman dignity cannot stand against empty benches. Cadbury's ramparts hold supplies, not consensus. Foster ties the web queens built strain to keep the worst from happening. Some succeed, children shuttled to safety. Archives wrapped and carted, hostages exchanged to prevent bright fools from earning revenge in winter. Some fail, a chapel burned because it fed the wrong mouths last month, a ferry held against the wrong colour cloak. In the eastern lowlands, settlements that Badon had kept cautious feel the edge of opportunity. This does not mean an instant tide, it means faster seepage. A village that changes speech more quickly, a market day where newcomers' prices dominate sooner, a boundary stone moved without the courtesy of witnesses. The west and north, busy repairing their own lattice, send fewer patrols along Roman roads that already knew they were mortal. A generation later, clerics writing in safer houses will remember Camlann not because of its flags, but because of the usury of its aftermath, years in which oaths cost more and bought less. What of the body and the blade? Keep the answers British and practical. A fallen leader of that stature is taken to a local sanctuary, an island in a marsh, a church with a stone that remembers older rites, a hall that can bar doors without inviting siege. The tale that the sword returns to water belongs here, not as valediction to pageant, but as policy, closing the account of a tool that must not become a feud's heirloom. A companion with an old Welsh name, Bedwyr, does the necessary, because a community needs an adult to perform endings exactly once, exactly right. The rumour that carries the king to a shrine, Glastonbury in later claim, is monastic politics braided to grief. Whether or not bones lay there is secondary to the function of such talk, to plant the story in British earth so foreign claimants cannot carry it away. The church will curate the memory, and not only out of piety. Monasteries make order out of endings. A bishop can tell a traumatised valley that virtue remains measured, feed the hungry, set just prices, honour guest right. He can write lists, saints' feasts, penances, genealogies, that give people calendars in place of campaigns. He can baptise the longing that follows disaster, once and future not as a prophecy of return from foreign shores, but as an island discipline. Leadership can be made here again if we remember how we made it before. Camlann, stripped of imported melodrama, is therefore intelligible and instructive. It is coalition politics failing under stress, scarcity, succession, pride, on an island that had held itself together for a generation by will and craft. It is a battle whose terrain we can imagine without moving our feet far from the roads we have walked in earlier segments, ford, lane, ridge, signals visible to both sides. It is an ending that breaks not because a single villain schemed brilliantly, but because many small accuracies lapsed at once. Tallies, tempers, timing. The lesson is not despair. Badon bought time, Camelot a circuit taught habits, queens kept benches fair. The warband learned to behave like neighbours in armour. Those habits do not vanish with two leaders. They recede in smaller halls, in parishes that remember how to set prices and punish theft without making new enemies, in foster bonds that outlast a campaign. A century later, scribes will still copy in British houses. Place names will still carry Brittonic bones. The sword in water scene will still teach that tools of the common peace belong to the land, not to lords. The coalition broke, the culture did not. So hold Camlann where the annal leaves it. A British field, a British grief, a British mortality. Hear the quiet that follows a horn that will not be heard again. See the careful hands that make sure the blade's last kiss is river cold. Then watch the island do what it has done in every hard season. Set chairs again, count grain again, teach children the names again, and practice the manners that, when luck allows, can be made leadership once more. Legends endure where roads still remember the feet that made them. Arthur's name, whatever its exact bearer in the 6th century, kept walking Britain, across parish hedges and moorland tracks, into monastic scriptoria and market gossip, down schoolroom recitations and up hill-fought paths where wind keeps the old syllables tidy. The island did not export him to gilded elsewhere so much as naturalise him anew in each century's needs. He remains a British solution to British problems, how to bind quarrelsome valleys, how to make edge serve law, how to face bad weather with decent manners and sharp tools, gin with place. Britain writes memory onto ground. A ridge above the Somerset level, South Cadbury, gathers the whisper Camelot, not because a charter says so, but because its ramparts, vastly rebuilt in the very window we need, feel like a seat where law and supper shared a fire. Caerleon, with Rome's bones still visible, teaches how stone keeps dignity for later tenants. Tintagel, with dangerous beauty and Mediterranean sherds, supplies the island's taste for cliff and court sharing a wall. None demands monopoly, all demand respect. In this way, Camelot becomes not a single dot on maps, but a circuit of working capitals, wherever the calendar set grain, oaths, and council under one roof, then text. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth gives Britain an expansive chronicle, Historia Regum Britanniae. He stitches earlier Welsh and Latin hints into a steady narrative. Arthur at Caerleon, a sword called Caliburnus, campaigns that stretch farther than our sober map allows but never lose the island's accent. Geoffrey writes for an Anglo-Norman world in Britain. His book travels because it offers a lineage to people hungry for one. Wace renders Geoffrey into French verse, and in doing so he coins the Round Table, a quality expressed as furniture. Stagecraft that suits the British need to circulate counsel. Layamon takes the matter into English, thick with native rhythms, and keeps the island's feel even as he borrows some of France's manners. Through these hands, Britain does not surrender Arthur, it learns to publish him. Parallel to the courtly growth, Welsh tradition keeps the texture coarse and vivid. In Caelhwlch and Olwen, Arthur is a British king presiding over feats with local names at local fords. Gwalchmai, Bedwyr, and Sa remain close to their hill country roots. Poems like Why Gododin use Arthur as a yardstick of courage, long before polished romance requires him to be a flawless mirror. The island thus preserves two necessary Arthurs, the practical captain who knows the ford's bottom, and the exemplar who trains hearts by giving them a name to aim at. Monasteries curate both. Scriptoria keep copying saints' lives, annals, law codes, and Arthur lives in the margins while monks preserve the main text that keeps parishes from forgetting prices and penances. In the 12th century, Glastonbury claims his grave. Whether bones were truly his matters less than the function of the claim. It plants the story in British earth, secures pilgrim roads for local abbots, and tells the island in an anxious age that its hero died here not far away, and so belongs here whenever memory needs him. Skepticism is healthy, so is understanding why communities build shrines, to give sorrow an address and hope a routine. Archaeology adds careful, unsentimental footnotes, refortified hill forts, high-status pottery along western sea lanes, timber and stone towns like Wroxeter that manage continuity after empire, inscribed stones with Latin and Ogham, all frame a landscape in which a federating ducks could operate. Spades do not find Arthur, they find his ecology. That is enough to keep the legend honest, grounded not in wishful pageantry but in the island's stubborn competence. When later readers meet Excalibur in a lake, 1,000 deposited blades in British waters quietly nod. When Bedwyr returns the sword, a long tradition of closing accounts with rivers nods back. By the later Middle Ages, chivalry refines the warband's rough virtues into code. Protect the weak, keep faith, spare when justice is satisfied, behave so roads remain useful. The Round Table, now firmly symbolic, teaches equality as arrangement rather than slogan. Seat rivals so they can listen. Mix captains with lawmen and stewards. Keep a chair for the one who says wait at the right time. Guinevere still, under her Englishing, keeps granaries balanced, gift exchange clean, and foster ties tight so coalitions do not dissolve under weather. Malory will ultimately bind these themes in English prose, Le Mort d'Arthur, and in doing so he gives late medieval England a moral mirror just as the old world trembles, fellowship forged, fellowship broken, repentance offered, the sword returned to the people's water. Once and future is Britain's neatest phrase for resilience. It does not promise a bodily return from foreign shores or a miracle of divine intervention. It is a deep-seated cultural promise that the island remembers and is capable of manufacturing leadership under immense pressure. When the inevitable cycles of invasions, plagues, famines, or deep political winters return, as history has proven they have and certainly will again, the foundational recipe for survival and renewal remains legible, inscribed in the landscape and the people's collective memory. This recipe includes practical, tested wisdom. Call the council in a simple working hall prioritizing function over pomp, count grain and secure logistics before indulging in flowery rhetoric. Make oaths short, binding and immediately payable. Meticulously teach disparate warbands to behave like respectful neighbours and citizens. Yoke the immovable church calendars to the practical necessities of market days and seasons. Ensure queenship is connected to ledgers and practical administration, not just ceremony. And critically return the tools of common peace and self-governance to common keeping when a season of crisis ends. If a particular century, perhaps one weary from conflict, needs the encouragement of romance to obey these ancient hard-won rules, the rules will be gracefully dressed in silk and golden embroidery. Conversely, if a century demands the discipline of austerity and hard truth, the rules will be scraped back to the raw, unyielding essentials of oak and iron. The constant, the enduring genius of the legend is the craft itself, unwavering courage, meticulous logistics, ingrained courtesy, and the steadfast adherence to law, principles repeated, practiced, and passed down until they become the very culture of the island. The very physical fabric of the land, its place law, works tirelessly to keep these embers of readiness hot and glowing. Children clambering on ancient moss-covered ramparts instinctively learn names and stories that are older than any books in their school curriculum. Every parish guide whispered folk tale, and local historian tells a version of the sleeping king who rests in a cave beneath a specific hill and will only wake when the ravens stop coming home to the tower. A profoundly British, practical way of saying that national and local readiness is an ongoing habit, a state of constant vigilance, not a passive, comforting daydream. The ancient fords across the rivers keep their rumours of passage. The sacred stones maintain their crosses and markings. The hedges, painstakingly managed for centuries, keep their familiar lanes and boundaries, and the seemingly empty moors maintain their deep, enduring patience, waiting for the necessary work. Each time a teacher or parent points at a dramatic skyline and says, "There, that's where the legend happened," the core story inherits a new vital breath from the present generation. And each time a steward or administrator writes an honest, uncorrupted tally of resources and taxes, the foundational story earns another year of cultural validity. Modern scholarship, adopting a temperament as cautious and stubborn as good weatherproofing, has matured to a point where it can allow the figure of Arthur to be both smaller and simultaneously larger than popular imagination might initially want. He's smaller in the sense that the verifiable historical core, if indeed one exists beneath the vast layers of myth, is likely a powerful but localized war leader, a dux bellorum, who effectively coordinated the diverse defences of disparate British kingdoms, and, through this effort, bought a precious span of peace and stability, a task that is noble enough without the need for an imagined empire. He's vastly larger in the profound sense that the legend's true enduring work is cultural and psychological. It is a continuous practical training program for a people in the art of serviceable hope and pragmatic self-governance. Ask any ancient hill in Somerset, any marked stone in Difford, or any flowing river in Devon, and they will collectively tell you the same message. The name Arthur does not belong to a single dead man, but to the island itself. Use it well as a symbol of your deepest capabilities. If one must stand in a single place to hear this complex blend of myth and practicality most clearly, choose a British threshold, the literal and metaphorical boundary, where the organised order of the house meets the unpredictable challenge of the weather outside. At your back, representing the achieved order of society, you have the comforting presence of benches, the fundamental security of bread, the structure of law seated immediately near the generosity of hospitality, a queen whose gifts are accurate and necessary rather than extravagant, a steward with the chalk dust of honest accounting on his sleeve, and a priest who keeps not just spiritual time but the vital calendar of the seasons. Before you, representing the challenge and the future, lie the open road, the essential beacon lines of communication, hedges that instinctively know and preserve the patrol's regular rhythm, and a ford that still remembers and judges whose sandals were honest when they crossed. Between these two realms, the ordered home and the demanding world, stands the essential duality of the legend. A sword that cut only what absolutely had to be cut for defence, and a scabbard that, through restraint and negotiation, saved more lives than the blade ever took in battle. That fundamental, balanced genius, the ability to be both strong and restrained, pragmatic and hopeful, is the lasting cultural treasure the Arthurian legend protects and perpetually transmits. Arthur is not a passport to a glorious past or a guarantee of future glory. He is a constant, ongoing, necessary practice. So the name goes on, in Welsh classrooms and English ones, in Cornish lanes and Cumbrian rain, in Breton songs across the narrower sea that still feels like home's cousin. Not to escape into glamour, but to remind the island that it has already learned how to be brave without being cruel, orderly without being dull, faithful without being blind. Once, when Badon held, future, whenever a hall somewhere lays its boards, counts its loaves, sharpens its oaths, and asks the right hands to sit. Kept on British ground, Arthur endures as a usable memory, a 6th century dux enlarged by centuries into a national mirror. Hill forts like Cadbury, Roman bones at Caerleon, cliff courts like Tintagel, all host the idea of Camelot as any hall where law, logistics and loyalty meet. Welsh names Guinevere, Bedwyr, Gwalchmai anchor the court. Caledfwlch returns to British water when work is done. From Geoffrey to Mallory, the island edits its own hero to teach steady virtues. Protect, keep faith, spare, provide. Once and future means this. Britain knows the craft of leadership already. When needed, it can lay the boards and light the fire again. The journey of the once and future king is now complete. Thank you for resting with mythic slumber. May your rest be deep, your courage renewed, and your discipline unwavering. Don't forget to subscribe, and return to the mist for your next night's sleep. Sleep well.